Genesis 41. How long must I wait? How long must I wait? This may have been what Joseph was saying to himself and to God as he waited inside his prison cell. His life had been filled with a lot of difficulties. From the beginning, his dreams and faithful reporting had engendered the hatred of his brothers. But now he was in prison, and it seemed that he was being punished for things that he had not done. In our lesson today, we will see how Joseph's faithfulness while waiting led to God using him in a surprisingly good way. If we, like Joseph, can learn to wait on God's timing, we will find that God's plan is worth waiting for. Number one, Joseph waited for the right time. He had asked the butler to remember him. If you remember, while he was in prison, two men had been thrown into prison by the Pharaoh and had dreams, and after interpreting their dreams, Joseph spoke to the butler, and here's what he said. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. After Joseph rightly interpreted the butler's dream, he pleaded with the butler to speak to Pharaoh about him. He wanted out of prison and did not deserve to be there in the first place. But what happened? Look down to verse 23. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. He was forgotten for 2 years. The sad statement at the end of the chapter is that the butler did not remember Joseph. Perhaps his sudden rise out of prison caused him to be extra careful around Pharaoh. Having been sent to prison once before, he didn't want to say the wrong thing and be sent back. But whatever the case, the butler did forget all of his troubles and Joseph along with them. Sometimes we're asked to wait. This may be especially hard when it doesn't seem fair. For Joseph, it wasn't fair, but it was God's perfect plan, as we will soon see. When we learn to wait upon the Lord, it will renew our strength and help us to endure what we could not otherwise. Number two, Joseph was called up at the right time. Well, there came a time where he was remembered by the butler. In chapter 41, verse 9, we read this. And the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream, and one night, he and I, each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream, and it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to office, and he hanged him. So, after nobody could interpret Pharaoh's dream, the butler's memory suddenly came back to him. He told Pharaoh about Joseph's successful interpretation of his and the baker's dream. So he was called up by Pharaoh. Verse 14 says, Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. He was called up by Pharaoh. The butler's story was enough to convince Pharaoh to have Joseph brought out of prison as quickly as possible. He shaved, put on clean clothes, and came into Pharaoh's throne room. Well, the next thing we see is he was used by God to interpret the Pharaoh's dream. Genesis 41, verse 16. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It's not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And then in verses 25 to 32, he interprets the dream. The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. One of the things I'm realizing as I'm reading the scripture to you is that those who were not with us last time would not know what the dream was that Pharaoh had. Pharaoh was given a dream by God, 2 of them. The first one had to do with some fat cows who came up out of the river, and then there were seven of them, and then seven gaunt, skinny cows came up, and the skinny ones ate up the fat ones. And then he woke up. Then he went back to sleep. He saw seven plump heads of grain, and then seven that were blighted and terrible looking. And the seven blighted ones ate the plump ones. But he didn't know what the interpretation of his dream was until Joseph gave him the interpretation. Notice that Joseph made sure to give God the credit for any interpretation that he would give. After hearing the dreams, Joseph gave Pharaoh the meaning. 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of famine, and God was letting Pharaoh know so that he could be prepared. But Joseph didn't just interpret the dream, he offered good advice to Pharaoh. Look at verse 33. He says, "Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine." So he offered good advice to Pharaoh. Without being asked, Joseph gave Pharaoh some advice that would help him be prepared for the coming famine. He advised him to put a discerning man in charge of the land so that grain could be stored up for the future. This was very good advice, which Pharaoh later considered. Sometimes our perspective about the best timing is often different than what God has planned. If the butler had remembered Joseph and he had been freed earlier from prison, any time before this time, he probably would have been lost in Egypt somewhere, and the butler would not have been able to find him. But because God's timing was perfect, Joseph was in prison at the time that he was needed. The Bible says, "Wait, I say, wait upon the Lord." And that's good advice. Our third point is that Joseph was promoted at the right time. The first thing that happened was he was recognized as a godly and wise person. Look down to verse 38. "And Pharaoh said to his servants, 'Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you.' And Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt.'" So he was recognized as a godly and wise person. Joseph didn't realize that he was candidating for the job. However, Pharaoh and his servants were watching and recognized his character. He was a man of God, and even the unbelieving Egyptians could see that. He was also a wise person, as his advice to them had shown. Because of this, he was given the job of overseeing the whole land of Egypt. Now, let's ask ourselves a question here. Where did this character come from? If you look back at Joseph's history, his father had put him in charge of looking over his brothers at one point. His father must have seen something in him, managerial character or skills. And then when he was a slave in Potiphar's house, he was put in charge of all of his house. When he was finally cast into jail under false accusations, the jailer had put him in charge of the prison. Listen, don't let hard times keep you down. Keep being faithful wherever you are. Another thing we see is he was honored by Pharaoh. In verse 42 to 45, we see that. "Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck." Joseph must have been very surprised. Just a few minutes ago, he had been waiting in prison, and now he was second in command behind Pharaoh, the king of the land. Besides the position, Joseph was honored with the king's signet ring, fine linen clothes, a gold chain around his neck, and the second best chariot in the land. When he drove the chariot through the land, people were told to bow before him. He was honored by Pharaoh. But he was also blessed with a wife and 2 sons. Look at verse 45. "And he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt." Now, It's interesting that Joseph, who had just been in prison, waiting on the Lord, he was put in charge of all the land of Egypt under only Pharaoh. But Pharaoh honored him in a great way, and he blessed him with a wife. Pharaoh gave Joseph a wife from one of the most prestigious families in Egypt. I've read that the priestly families were the highest in society. While we would not condone marrying someone outside of the faith today, Joseph didn't seem to have a choice in the matter. I imagine that Joseph did everything he could to lead her to faith in the one true God. And then he later was blessed with two sons as well. Each of them caused him to think of God. God's blessings made him forget his former trials, and he was thankful for all that God had provided. Now, who would have expected all of this? Joseph was the vice pharaoh, if you will. He was wealthy, respected, married with children. But all of this came about in God's perfect timing. The fourth point, Joseph was wise at the right time. It's interesting to think about how old Joseph was at this time. Usually when we think of leaders, they, especially of countries, they're older, much more experienced. But what does Genesis 41:46 say? Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He was only 30 years old when he was put in charge of this whole country. This wouldn't generally be a good idea for most people. But Joseph was someone who was wise and strong in character. He had grown immensely in those 13 years away from home. And then if you continue reading verse 46, you'll see he was not only just 30, but he was trustworthy. Let's see, verse 46. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. So what does this say? When Joseph left Pharaoh's throne room, what did he do? He immediately traveled throughout the land of Egypt. What was he doing? He was taking his job seriously. He was to he was to manage the land. And so he traveled through it looking at what he would be working with. Pharaoh could trust him because he was faithful. He's someone who wanted to do his job well. So, knowing the dream and the significance of the dream that God had given to Pharaoh, Joseph decided to take action. He gathered grain. Look in verse 47. Now in the 7 plentiful years the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. To prepare for the coming famine, he gathered large amounts of grain. He did this in every city. He must have seemed like a hoarder to the Egyptians. Why is he storing away so much grain? We have more than enough right now. But they didn't know what was ahead. You see, he was preparing for the famine, and when that famine came, he was prepared. Drop down to verse 53. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. So he was prepared for the famine. When the plentiful 7 years were ended, the famine came. Egypt had bread for a while, but when it ran out, the people came to Pharaoh for help. And Pharaoh sent them to Joseph, who had the grain, the abundance of grain that he had saved when everybody didn't think they needed to. People from other lands even came to Egypt for food as well. Now, was anybody questioning Joseph's actions? I think not. You know, sometimes wise people don't seem wise. They do things that don't seem necessary. They prepare for the future. They save for the future. They organize what they have. And when those things are necessary, when those things are unnecessary, the wise man seems to be foolish. But when trouble comes, he's ready and the others are not. What do we learn? Be a wise person. Follow good advice. You won't regret it. Now, in conclusion, Joseph had a rough beginning, but everything worked out in the end. He had to endure being hated by his brothers, being sold into slavery, being falsely accused of sexual assault, being kept in prison, and being forgotten by those he helped. But during that time, Joseph remained faithful to the Lord, made himself useful wherever he went, and was eventually rewarded and used by God. Joseph later noted that it was God's plan for him to go through those troubles to save much people alive. It must have been difficult, but thankfully Joseph waited on the Lord and reaped the benefits in God's perfect timing. We often want to rush ahead of God's timing instead of waiting, but that often leads us out of God's plan and into a worse situation. Be a wise person. Trust the Lord and wait on his perfect timing.